whenever you're ready, you can start with your introduction.
So I'm Carolyn Siegel. I'm coming from Silicon Valley in California, although I'm originally an East Coaster. I I currently work as Associate Director of College Counseling at Pinewood School in Los Altos Hills, California. But my sort of professional trajectory has started in the classroom. Initially, I worked abroad as a teaching assistant in a bilingual elementary school, and then I went on to become a Spanish teacher, and I worked as a Spanish teacher for quite some time in the independent school world. I took a break from that to do graduate work at Brown, and also got to teach Spanish to Brown University students, which was great and an experience I'm very thankful for. Then I went back to the classroom and also to an administrative role as a chair of a world language department, where my primary responsibility was professional development and curriculum development, which is something I'm still really excited about. And yeah, and that sort of journey has led me to where I am today, still in the independent school world, but more in an administrative capacity.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Amazing introduction. You've done so much within, your education career, from being abroad and then coming back and, working in like different school settings, going on with graduate studies, seeing kind of higher ed as well, undergrad, and then you find yourself in college counseling. And so I guess what I would love to hear a little bit more about is kind of like the drive to be a teacher or to be in education. Like what's something that is like a deeper motivation for you to want to work in this particular field that's, let's be honest, riddled with issues, sometimes not paid enough, or undervalued. There's a long list of grievances that teachers like myself can share. But yeah, what about you, would you say is like the kind of driving force behind it? What's the origin stories for Carolyn to decide to be an educator?
So I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. My twin sister is deaf, and my whole life long, everything I would learn, I would sort of turn around and help her with. And I was very conscious of how different her educational trajectory was from my own. I just sort of like we both faced challenges, but her challenges were very different. And I think that always gave me a sense of perspective, not only for my own positionality, not only for her experiences, but also for that of really anyone else. And I knew I wanted to get into education. I wasn't always clear that I wanted to be in the classroom, but I remember early in my teaching career going back to some of my teachers, and my high school AP English teacher said something to me that really resonated. And she said, a lot of people who become teachers because they've had a teacher, or many, that were highly impactful. And I feel always a deep sense of gratitude for my secondary school educational experience. It was really excellent. And I think that's what sort of powered me to be in the classroom to this day. And actually, before you and I started our master's degree together, when I was sort of soul searching and deciding what I wanted to do next, I found through LinkedIn, and I met up with two of my teachers from my secondary school education who became leaders in their fields, their respective environments or contexts. And those were very inspiring conversations, right? And I'm a person who really thrives on connectivity, the theme of today's conversation. And and I don't know, it just felt like, yeah, if those teachers are willing to think deeply and to out of nowhere talk to someone they have not seen for 25, 30 years about this field, like, isn't that something that we all want to be a part of? Something that has that level of meaning across time.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And at times it might feel a little bit scary, I would imagine. This is been my experience of going back to schools and seeing old teachers and just understanding that we both have changed. And at the same time, like there's a certain kind of immortalized image of who I thought they were and how they impacted me. But then now I'm presenting myself anew. And there's this kind of interesting interplay between like, oh, like what can I learn from you now? Right? I don't know, there's this sense for me that like even though we're adults now, they still occupy a certain seat of, authority or knowledge that I aspire towards or that I just have such appreciation for. And I don't know if that's the same for you, but those interactions I think are really special to be able to see that.
Absolutely. But I think, like, for example, the idea that my eighth grade math teacher was willing to talk to my 40-year-old self um, about his field and his experiences, like, does not speak to what an educator is at his, her, or their
Mhm.
core, I think.
Yeah,
I think
constantly
that's
being open, learning, wanting to connect. That's what you mentioned about the connectivity part of it. I think that's really beautiful. And I have this wonderful memory of going back to the retirement party of my kindergarten teacher. This was several years ago, and I thought back then when I was a kindergartner that she was already old. I mean, of course, I was little, but I thought, oh wow, like she's still been teaching all this time. And,
mhm.
she was very much at the kind of like, that age where, she looked like that iconic grandma was just like so caring and like pure like white hair, but still like so youthful. And the fact that she was able to spot me and remember me, like remembered my name. She remembered that I was like the lion in this circus kind of event that they had, like all these different animals and, things like that. And we dressed up. Um, just that like recognition, I think also is just so powerful, right? In society, as adults, we're thriving to get recognition and validation. And sometimes these memories of our early teachers who very generously gave that and held on to it, I think also speaks to what makes for a great teacher. I don't know if you would like to share a little bit more about the interaction with the AP history teacher, or if there's another teacher that really comes to mind. But like, what are some qualities would you say that make for a great teacher?
Mm. I think it's empathy, a deep sense of empathy, and a deep sense of curiosity, right? Knowing when I was in school in my formative years, it was all about being the sage on the stage, but now I think it's so much more about being that guide on the side, right? And so I think it's really important to be curious and to be vulnerable and be willing, that willingness to be vulnerable in front of your students, I think is essential.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like I've heard of sage on the stage. I'm like getting my tongue all mixed up. But guide on the side also is really nice.
It's not my own. I can't take credit for it, but I've heard it before. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great, just kind of sharing it. And so like, yeah, these qualities of like empathy and curiosity, I think also um, really connect. Well, they go well with connectivity. I was about to say that really connects with connectivity, but that would have been that sounds a little silly. And yeah, and I think that I would imagine now for yourself as a teacher, as an educator, as a current graduate student, again, and as a mother, right? I would say that those are vital to really be able to know how to instruct others, how to guide others, how to facilitate conversations, um, and how to build those very same qualities in
Mhm.
in the young learners in front of you or around you, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's wonderful that, when speaking about your like the big why of being in education, you immediately went to these teachers, right, in your formative years. And then before that, talking about your twin sister, who is deaf, and whom you really wanted to support, and out of this great sense of love. But then also, I'm sure as a young learner, this excitement of like, well, I want to make sure that everyone can, you know, know what I'm learning. Like this is great,
Absolutely.
kind of checking
Yeah.
in. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more if you can about the maybe some of like the the highs and lows of like what that entailed, wanting to have your sister kind of be on the same page as you, and like what would you say like you besides like the perspective of like, wow, she's encountering more obstacles than I am, but like what would you say was like that kind of relationship as you were trying to, really encourage and support your sister?
It was very complicated to sum up in a in a short conversation. But I guess I will say that one of my biggest takeaways that I really hold on to even today in my day-to-day interactions with students is that one, everybody's journey looks different. And it's important that we remember that in an age of like social media where everyone's constantly being sort of hounded with these images of what life should be, what your physical appearance should be, what success should look like. I think it's really important that we, as the adults in the room, remind students and help to ground them in the reality that success can look different for many different people. And then I guess the other piece is the journey to success can look very different, right? So both parts, the product, but the process as well.
Yeah, thank you. I know that was like a almost impossible question to
It
sum
was a
up.
little loaded.
But I appreciate that. And I maybe got a little ahead of myself just because, currently for the J term, I'm taking a course on inclusion where we are learning about various different disabilities and also just, really coming to grips with how society, the way that it is organized, the way that it is structured, the way that everyone is conditioned follows a very normative kind of lifestyle that is not equitable by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, there was this statistic in terms of like just out of the entire world population, 15% are actually, kind of considered to have some form of disability, whether it's visible or invisible, um, which is about 1 billion people. So it's like that. It's not a kind of marginal thing, and it's also not something that we will be able to forever elude as we kind of continue to age, and that disability is actually part and parcel of just being alive. And yet we have such rigid perceptions of what society expects of us and how we can navigate through society with those expectations. And so it's just got me really thinking about like for yourself and this and with your twin sister, like it got you really kind of acknowledging and understanding that like, yeah, what works for me won't necessarily work for my sister, and how multiple perspectives really is so important to kind of pop that illusion of like what society is often telling us, right?
I will say, I guess what I would add though is in the moment, right, as I was growing up with my sister at my side, my perception of her experience was really different than what it is today. I don't think that I, in any way, I mean, I understood it was difficult. I understood she had challenges, that, different things happened to her that were not part of my lived experience. And that I definitely understood as a child, even as a small child. Um, but like the depth and the complexity of what she was experiencing, I don't think she was able to articulate until she became an adult. And listening to her tell her story again and again, which I have, that actually has what has given me perspective on it. So the compassion piece was there, the empathy was there, but not the true understanding. And even to this day, I'd venture to say that it's what right in the conversations of inclusivity and of recognition, belonging that we have in education today, right? Like I can't pretend to know how hard it's been for her. And she's my twin sister. She looks just like me. Um, we get confused, like, right? But our lived experience has been incredibly different. And it would be insincere for me to say that I like have complete understanding of it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, well, thank you for being so frank in that kind of assessment with your sister. I mean, there's sometimes that you know this notion, and I've seen this in probably like TV shows, honestly, of like, oh, you're twins, so you have like telepathy, right? You just know you can complete each other's. No,
Thoughts.
yeah. I was about to say
No, you
sentences, but
can't.
yeah, that's why we're not twins. Because if we were twins,
That's
no,
synthesis.
that's
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
it's the wrong perception. But even more so when that person's experience and how the world responds and reacts to like how she just naturally exists, I mean, there's certain level of oppression that just sets on those who don't conform or don't aren't modeled in the way that society is expecting them to be. That yeah, now that this course I'm taking is really getting me just thinking more and more about that because I think it's I mean, having more perspective, having more empathy, striving for more understanding without necessarily getting to a point of like, oh, I know everything about that, right? Because that'll never happen. But I find it to be also really crucial when it comes to how we try to support our students. Because of course we want what's best for them. And yet it's nuanced in terms of like what we actually can extend to them or what how far we can go in knowing them.
And
And
I think that's
um
okay.
And it's okay. Yeah, because we're doing
I
our
don't think
best.
anyone expects, I don't think, I would never expect, like, I would never expect you to know everything or fill in all the spaces between the lines of my life experience. I think it's okay. I think the important thing is showing genuine curiosity, interest and care, right?
And so I think that genuine, curiosity, interest, care, right? What you just said, applies to your current work that you're doing as a college counselor. From my understanding, it's tricky in that you're presented with these students, these human beings who have like this whole story, right? This whole context. And and now you're kind of at this crossroads of okay, you're soon to graduate, let's say, or you're a junior and or third year student and you're kind of looking ahead and you're charting forward this future that's also just really foggy, right? In many senses of like where you want to go, what you want to study, and how you'll actually get there through the process. And so like what has been one of the biggest challenges for you as a college counselor in helping students just understand what's the task at hand?
Huh. So I'm sort of gonna answer your question in a little bit of a roundabout
Yeah, of
way,
course.
if that's okay. So I don't think it's the biggest challenge. Students come into the process thinking that the biggest challenge is choosing the appropriate schools for them and writing those essays, filling out the application. And I actually think that the most difficult part of the process, at least in my limited experience, I've only been a college counselor for a few years and in only one context, but I think it's a journey of understanding the self. I work in a context, not surprisingly, in Silicon Valley. I work in a context that covers students from a number of different backgrounds. A lot of their parents were born in other countries and did not go through this same process to apply to college. And so they really lean, both families and students, they really lean on me and my supervisor, the director of college counseling at my school, to be sort of almost cultural ambassadors as they go through this journey. So that's part of it that I think is really, I don't know if it's like challenging per se, but it's really intriguing. It's a part I find to be the most intriguing, and how families from different cultures and different backgrounds sort of understand this moment in time.
Yeah, because that's all and like, any of us are just navigating this current moment in time and
Yeah.
then trying to take actions based on that. But I do appreciate how you're able to frame this this task, right? Of like, okay, what college do I want to go to, or what is college? As more of a journey, as more of the kind of means rather than the ends, which people just kind of immediately shout, "Oh, this is the college, right? I've done it. The hard part's over." And yet, like,
The
what
hard part's just starting.
the hard part is just starting, yeah. And a lot of kids and adults included, right? Like doing the hard stuff is well, not very attractive. We tend to avoid it. We procrastinate. We put it off to the side. And yet, how to get students to engage and really find joy in taking ownership of that journey, to highlight some of some of the flaws, but also some of the, great strengths that they have. And, I think, and I kind of come from the other side of the table. I spent a year and a half as an admissions counselor at a university, right? So the table being like there's a college counselor from high school, there's this table that just sits in between, and then, universities that make decisions. And, it's really to see students um, as best we can in their kind of their complexity in a snapshot, and then to see, wow, okay, we want this kind of student here, not necessarily the 4.0, or at this point, some of them are getting like 5.0s or something ridiculous.
Mm.
Um, it's not just the grades, right, that just tell the story, but there's so many other important data points as well that should be brought up, especially with
Well,
their
in the
parents.
United States higher educational system, evaluative system,
That's
right?
true.
That's not actually the case in most other countries. And so I think that that sort of speaking to the theme of global citizenship. So that's what I view working as a college counselor in Silicon Valley to be one of the most sort of interesting and intriguing aspects of the job, because many of our families are coming from home cultures that did not have that kind of evaluative process. And that could be that because they come from basically South America, it could be because they come from Europe, Africa, it could be because they come from Asia. It really, with outside of the United States, in my experience, there are some institutions, but much more limited, that look at students in that same quote unquote holistic way that students are evaluated in the United States. So I think that that's what maybe even furthers the existential crisis of our students in that process, right? Because they're 16 or 17, so they're already thinking about like, who am I in the world and who do I want to become? That's normal. And I think that that's pretty universal for that age range. But whereas in some countries it would be like, I need to prepare for the test, or I've already taken one test to get to this part of my high school career, and so now I have to take the next one, which will land me on course A or course B or whatever it might be. In the US, obviously there are 4,000 institutions of around 4,000 institutions of higher education, give or take 3,000 that are 4-year institutions, and from an independent school in Silicon Valley, give or take about 3 to 500 that our students are generally considering, right?
Yeah.
It's not always the 3 to 500, but that's like the broad strokes.
Mhm.
There are exceptions.
And I'm so glad that you bring that up, and it's so relevant to your specific context, right? Where you have parents coming from all different cultures and backgrounds, and so like what I'm just curious, like what's like the initial kind of like from the initial conversation that you will have with these like parents, just generalizing, like a parent from not the US, what's like the first one or two kind of points that you try to like bring up to get them to start to understand this approach that like, yes, grades are important. Yes, you should continue to encourage them to work hard, study hard, and yet let's try to see it from the holistic perspective. Like, how do you convince them, in a way, or
We don't
can
always convince them. We don't
yeah,
always convince them, and nor do we always look to, because sometimes that's just not going to happen.
yeah,
I will say that we actually start the conversations way earlier than junior year. We talk with parents in larger community conversations starting in ninth grade. So they've been hearing this message for a while by the time their actual student gets into the process, begins the application process in the spring semester of junior year. Um, and yeah, I don't think it's not a game of convincing. It's definitely more a conversation or a dialogue, let's say, where we are purveyors of information about what the process is and what it means. And families, they take that information and they do with it what they want. That's the joy of being in an independent school. Or when you choose to send your child to an independent school, right? That you too have a lot of say in what you want to do with that information. But we try to have our families and our students be as informed as possible about how they will be evaluated, how we can support them. I think the more interesting conversations really come with the students. And it's interesting. Um, so I started as a college counselor before the SCOTUS decision about including aspects of identity in the application, and that now I'm continuing on the other side of that decision. And when we first started, I had students who had not been thinking particularly deeply about their identity. And so the college process was actually one of the first times that they had to sit there and answer it in deeper terms and more complex terms. And now it's more optional, right? Students have a wider sort of range of aspects of identity that they might include in their application, and also they can also choose to not include. um, but it's funny, I've started to lean more on my language teaching background than I thought I would. In language teaching, there's this image that's often shared called the cultural iceberg. So you see a big picture of an iceberg, and on the top half, it's the things that we all know about culture, the things that in the 90s, when I was studying Spanish, that was what Spanish class was. It was food, it was music, and it was dance, more or less, right? And
Telenovelas.
that's on the right. And what? Sorry,
Telenovelas.
exacto, and
Yes.
telenovelas, of course. Um, and so that's the top of the cultural iceberg. But when you look on below that, below the water, right, and you see all these aspects uh, of the cultural iceberg, it's all these other pieces that are so much deeper, uh, like self-reflection, how cultural awareness, gender dynamics, like all of these different things. And so actually I've been using that in my dialogues with my students and saying, okay, if we look at this cultural iceberg, I know you can tell me about the top of the iceberg, but think about what it says about who you are in all these aspects below the water's edge. And it's so interesting. It's been sort of promoting these much more profound conversations with students, because they haven't really thought about all of those things and how they factor in. And so it's sometimes the essays, the way their supplemental essays might be phrased from a university, it's no longer like, what is your race and how does that function in terms of who you are as a human. It's much more like, how do you view yourself as a member of a community, and what do you do to be inclusive. And
Yeah.
so that reframing I actually think has been really interesting, for at least in this 1 year of going through the application process and watching how students have to really dig and think much more critically, much more deeply about how their identity impacts who they are, how they exist in the world, and how they interact with others. And so I don't know, just something curious that I've been seeing in my office, and really I've been appreciative of. And it's been unexpected because, of course, when SCOTUS came out with the decision, we were all, you know, there was a lot of talk in across the country about what the implications of that decision would ultimately be, and we're still, we still haven't seen what the numbers are. In California, it's long not been a part of the process, as I imagine as someone who grew up in California. When you were in high school and applying to the UCs, it was your race was not considered, and like that, those numbers are reflected in the demographics of the UCs. So we'll see how it plays out this year across the country. But at least in my office, in the conversations that I'm having, I think it's been really awesome to hear how students are taking those questions and sort of digging a little deeper.
Yeah, and I think I find that to be such a beautiful metaphor, the iceberg. And it's just so visual, right? I mean, I like that I can, understand that identity is really complex and I don't, even fully understand everything, but like at least I can visualize this sense of like, okay, above water, below water, and then this sense that like, it's an iceberg. So you'd imagine going underneath the water to understand and see the larger, the actual iceberg itself is frigid water. So it's like it's not always going to be easy. And if anything, it's going to be quite painful in the first couple minutes, right? Or the first initial descent before your body adapts. And then you get hypothermia if you stay there too long. No, I'm just kidding. No, we don't want to talk
I
about
think
that. That's
I
where
think
the limits are.
you're taking the metaphor the metaphor a little bit too far. I
Yeah.
was
Or
thinking
maybe for wet
actually,
sound.
I was thinking a little bit about the class that you and I took this fall, and the text we read. Annette Leroux, I believe she's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and the text on social class and all of that. And it's, you know you can think of identity as racial identity, religious identity, gender identity, sexual preference, sexual identity. Um, Sorry, gender identity. I already said it. Religion, but so in our class when we were learning about social class, I thought it was interesting because there are so many aspects of our social class that are on the surface, but there are so many ways that our social class like impacts us deeply below the surface. And as we were reading LaRoe's text, it was just something that I thought about a lot, and sort of the unseen pieces, kind of going circling back to what we were talking about earlier with my sister and everything. Like, what are the unseen pieces of a person's experience, right? And I think about this a lot as someone who did teach Spanish for a really long time and also taught Portuguese. Um, when you're teaching students, they haven't necessarily had the same level of contact with the Spanish speaking world, with the Portuguese speaking world as you have. In fact, that's generally unusual. And I think that the main sort of message that you want to convey to your students as a language teacher and a teacher of many other disciplines, right, is not that you're going to know all of those below the iceberg aspects of a person or of a people, but that you're going to have an awareness that they exist and a curiosity, right, as you interact with people and with people's across your life experience.
Yeah, and life is long, right? You will be able to continue exploring and keeping that curiosity alive. I mean, I've heard that schools sometimes like they say it kills creativity, it kills curiosity, um, when in fact we should bring that up more, or we should highlight them more in conversations with students, with parents as well. Because yeah, I think that's something that is vital to how we grow and how we come to grips with our ever evolving identities. And so, this, I think the question of like, I mean, not the question, but um, this conversation about identity, and then also from, earlier in our conversation about how you've spoken to the importance of connectivity as really vital in the work that you do as an educator and why you do the work that you do as an educator. I think this ties into the question of like, yeah, how does this tie in? Like, how does this connect with global citizenship? And so, I think there's definitely some like keywords that you can point to maybe put some kind of definition together. But yeah, how would you say, like, what would you, how would you explain to one of your students what global citizenship is? And does that connect at all to the iceberg metaphor, or does it connect to a specific term? Like, yeah.
Absolutely. So a huge part of being a language teacher, which I still define myself fundamentally as a language teacher, even though that's no longer what I do and likely not what I will do in the future, um, it is this idea of developing global competence in our students. So kind of circling to what I was saying before, when I was a student, you were learning these more superficial aspects of the Spanish speaking world. You weren't digging deep into complex aspects of history, of language, of culture, of literature, the way hopefully you are today. So in Actful's sort of competencies, they talk about global competence, which is being a global citizen. And it's essentially knowing these surface level things, understanding and having deep enough understanding of those below the water iceberg aspects of culture, so that you can interact in meaningful and empathetic ways with people in the world, in your community, in your local community, and beyond, right? Because, and this isn't just true for Spanish, it's true for many other languages, depending on where you live in the United States. Definitely in my community, there are many people who do not speak English or have limited English, and represent so many different countries. And anyway, so it's this idea of having empathy for how you interact with those people, right? And I think it does, while I generally speak Romance languages, I really view what I've learned from them as translating to how I interact with all people from all cultures. It's true that if language is a barrier, that I don't necessarily have that aspect, but even when I'm walking around my neighborhood, I often bump into some of the Chinese grandparents that live in my neighborhood, and I use whatever handful of words I know, gestures, kindness, to greet them, to show that recognition. I know you, I've seen you, I see you all the time. They see me, they see my kids. And I think that that's a part of being a global citizen, is making people feel seen, welcome, and when you can, understood.
I love that. Yeah. And when I think about my first ventures abroad, I felt so scared to say anything in Spanish. That was the language I was trying to improve. And so because of my reluctance to speak Spanish, And because of this perceived notion that everyone around me just didn't care at all, they
Mhm.
weren't eager to just be like drop everything and be like, let's learn Spanish together. Like, let me help you out. But like I felt this distance and I was craving some kind of like recognition or some kind of like, oh, I exist over here. And so I think that's just so important to really understand like through the process of learning a language. It's so humbling because it just shows you how little you know, just anything. And so when you are able to hold on to that and you listen to someone who's learning English, right? Maybe they're stumbling and or any other language, like you just have so much more patience, and so much more grace for what that person must be going through if you've experienced it yourself, especially.
100%, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's subtle. It's not always so obvious as knowing the words to say. Sometimes it really is just small things, but I think it can make a huge difference. And it's the awareness, right? It's so important to me. Like, for example, as a parent, I always think about how my kids exist in the world and how they can show respect. And so I think as we think about global citizenship, it is that like there's no way that you're going to have an arsenal of tools for all cultures, for all languages, for all people from those from those cultures, right? Um, but if you have sort of a baseline toolbox of how to interact, ideally being your most authentic self with an open heart and an open mind, I think that's it's a good place to start.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much. This has been such a lovely talk. I do have one more question that I wanted to ask you before we wrap
Oh,
up.
sure, sure.
And it's a pretty quick one. If you can just share either a book or a movie recommendation. This could be something that you've recently watched or seen, but is there
You're
anything
not
that
gonna
comes?
like. I knew you were gonna ask that, and
Yeah.
you're not gonna like my answer. Okay, my answer is not a particular book or film,
Okay.
but it's a tool.
Yes.
There is a website called languagereactor.com. And if you go to that website, there's a Google Chrome extension. And I believe there are other beta extensions for other web browsers. And you can go and watch your Netflix movies and TV series. And it's a tool for practicing your languages. So, for example, if you're studying Tamil and there is a film in Netflix in Tamil, then you can use Language Reactor to understand the film, but also to sort of gain not just words but also expressions and all of that. And it's been in beta for a long time, maybe years, I would say, like maybe 10 years. And it's constantly changing and improving, but I think it's a great tool.
Wow. I've never heard of that. But I will definitely look into it myself. I'm always trying to, well, I'm trying to get better in my Korean, and I feel like that might be really helpful with all the K-dramas that I find myself watching nowadays. I might have to put this as an add-on.
Crash landing on you, it's in your future with languagereactor.com.
Amazing. I have seen Crash Landing on You. That's a good one. That was your recommendation. You got a tool and a recommendation for a TV
Oh
series.
no.
Yes.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Carolyn. And yeah, I just feel like this has been such a wonderful conversation to get to know more about your background and education, your current work, and how you tie that to the journey of understanding what is my authentic self, what is the purpose that I'm kind of moving ahead towards, especially if that is a US college, and kind of what that means for them and their future and their families. And yeah, I'm just really excited that we have more studies ahead of ourselves with the program that we're currently in, and that things are constantly in flux. We're going to learn, we're going to adapt, and yeah, it's we're going to grow our own identities as like teachers and global citizens. So with that, the last word I would like to give to you, if you have any final thoughts, or if you just want to sign off and just be like, thanks a bunch, but anything you'd like to share, just.
No, thank you so much for having me today. And I look forward to listening to more of your podcast episodes moving forward.
Thank you.